My name is Andrew Knight. I practiced in small animal clinical veterinary practice for around about 8 years before entering academia. I'm currently a veterinary professor of animal welfare and ethics and founding director of the Centre for Animal Welfare at the University of Winchester. And when I was practicing as a cat and dog veterinarian, I developed a special interest in plant-based diets for cats and dogs and conducted a lot of research into that field. People these days are increasingly aware of the adverse consequences of meat-based diets, certainly for humans, and starting to worry about those for companion animals too. So we're talking about serious environmental consequences, the health problems that people are experiencing from overconsumption, particularly of animal products, and potentially our cats and dogs as well, that are becoming increasingly overweight and developing a range of associated problems. And they're also aware of other concerns too, such as farm animal welfare. So people's awareness of these is increasing, and they're increasingly interested in plant-based diets for cats and dogs. If you search back throughout history, there are a couple of prominent cases of actually vegetarian lions, believe it or not. One was a very famous vegetarian lioness called Little Tyke, who was raised on an animal sanctuary in California in the 1950s with a lovely couple, Georges and Margaret Westbow. And they raised Little Tyke with a lamb, a deer and a swan, all of whom became her firm friends. And she hadn't been raised with other lionesses on the plains of Africa hunting and killing so-called game animals. And so she didn't associate other animals as food. Accordingly, she wouldn't eat any meat. Now, the Westbows were made very worried by the veterinarians telling them that Little Tyke would become seriously ill if she didn't eat any meat. And so they posted a $1,000 reward back in the 1950s. That was a lot of money for anyone who could successfully feed some meat to Little Tyke. Many tried to claim this reward, but no one was ever successful. She was completely resistant to eating any meat. To look after her health, they fed her a double handful of cooked grains chosen for their protein, calcium, fats and roughage content, 2 eggs and half a gallon of milk per day. And she wasn't gnawing on bones or other hard things, so to protect the health of her teeth, they gave her a rubber gumboot with her favourite perfume sprinkled on it. And she greatly enjoyed chewing on the gumboots, and one gumboot would last her about a month. By the time she was 4 years old, she was 10 feet 4 inches long, she was fully grown. She could run at 40 miles an hour, about 65 kilometres an hour, and she was about 180 pounds, about 360 kilograms in weight. And one of America's most experienced zoo curators said that she was the healthiest African lioness that he had ever seen. So at that point they finally stopped worrying about what their veterinarians had been warning them about, that she would become very ill if she didn't eat any meat. What animals associate with food depends very much on how they've been raised by their parents and the behaviour of their siblings. So they are socialised in certain ways, they learn behaviour, they are encouraged to learn hunting behaviours if they're carnivores, and to eat animals by their parents. But if they're not raised in that way, their behaviour will be entirely different. Cats, dogs and other animals don't need meat or any other particular ingredient any more than we do. What they need and what we need is a certain set of nutrients, and the nutrient profile will be different for cats and dogs and humans, and it will differ between males and females. It will differ depending upon the life stage, so very young, very old, pregnant, lactating, undergoing high levels of exercise and so on. So cats certainly don't need meat. What they do need is a specific set of nutrients depending on their life stage. Some people are worried about the specific nutrients that cats need. You can find lists of these. Our recent publication documenting the health and nutritional aspects of plant-based versus meat-based diets for cats and dogs includes these lists of nutrients. They're also on my website, veggiepets.info. There's no scientific reason why a diet that's comprised entirely of plant, mineral and synthetic ingredients cannot be formulated to meet all of the nutritional needs that cats, dogs or any other species has. And a growing number of commercially available diets aim to do exactly that. There are a small number of plant ingredients which can be potentially toxic to cats and dogs, which are alright for human beings. For example, avocado seeds can be toxic to dogs. Very small numbers of ingredients like this. Onions can be toxic to dogs. but the numbers of these potential toxins is actually very small. It's important when people are choosing plant-based diets for their cats or dogs that they do all they can to make sure the diet is nutritionally complete. If it is not nutritionally complete, there are likely to eventually be adverse health consequences, probably not in the first week or the first month, but eventually. So it's important to make sure there is a claim on the packaging or the labelling that the diet is nutritionally complete for adults or for young animals. The second thing that I advise everyone to do is actually to contact the company if they have the time and to ask them what do they do to try to ensure the quality and the consistency of the diet over time. What quality control measures are there? And secondarily, have they ever submitted their diet to independent laboratories to check the nutritional content of the diet? Companies don't normally provide this kind of information. I think if enough people ask for this kind of information, they would all start to do so. Animals don't have requirements for any particular ingredient, meat or anything else. They have requirements for specific nutrients. Additionally, it's important that diets are formulated to be sufficiently palatable so that animals will choose to eat them. So they need to taste okay, they need to smell okay, because the sense of smell is really important for cats and dogs, much more so than for people. They need to look all right, and they need to have an appropriate texture. Sometimes even warming the food can help a bit. So it needs to be sufficiently palatable. Secondarily, it needs to be nutritionally sound. It needs to be formulated to supply all the nutrients that the animals need. And thirdly, it needs to be sufficiently bioavailable, so primarily digestible, but also absorbable into the cells of the body. Now, the digestibility of different ingredients is not 100%, whether they're meat-based or plant-based diets. The information about digestibility is not available for some ingredients. The information that is available suggests that the digestibility of meat-based diets is often, maybe around 80%, depending upon the ingredient. For plant-based, it might be a little less, it might be 70%. There's not a big difference between them. It's important that people feeding a plant-based diet to cats or dogs actually think about the urinary acidity, because sometimes when transitioning onto a plant-based diet, the urine can become a little bit more alkaline, and this can be a problem because it can cause crystals to start to crystallize out of the urine and come together to form tiny stones, and then bigger stones are potentially blockages of the urinary outflow, and that's potentially very serious if that happens. It only affects a really small proportion of animals, and male cats have the biggest risk because they have the smallest urethra, the outflow. But I advise that people check the acidity of the urine for all the animals, for cats and dogs, males and females, at least once a month throughout life. And if they're making any changes to the diet or if there's any concerns about the urine, once a week. It's actually quite easy to collect urine samples. For dogs, you can get a foil baking tray and put it under the dog when it goes to urinate. For cats, you can get non-absorbent little white plastic beads from your veterinarian and put them into the kitty litter tray and collect a urine sample that way. Once you have the urine sample, you can check the acidity by putting in a paper litmus test strip, which changes colour and tells you what the acidity is. For a more accurate reading, you can use a pH meter that you might get for example, from a pet store that you might put into a fish tank to check the acidity of the water. If the urine is starting to become a little bit too alkaline, then there are things that you can add into the diet to correct it, and they can be mild, moderate or strong. And to see what the normal urine acidity is and to see what you can add into the diet, people should check my website, which is vegepets.info, vegepets.info. Dogs often have a reputation for eating first and asking questions later. Cats can be much more fussy, especially old cats that have been maintained on a particular flavour of meat-based diet for very many years and have become somewhat behaviourally addicted to that particular type of diet. So these animals can be hard to transition. For everybody, I advise making more of a gradual transition than a sudden transition, ideally transitioning over perhaps 2 weeks. But it's okay to take longer if necessary. This will allow time for the digestive enzymes to change, to transition to a different food, and allow time for the bacterial population in the intestines to change as well, and minimise the chance of any adverse reactions such as diarrhoea or other gastrointestinal reactions. It's important that when making the transition, people encourage their animals by providing only fresh food, smelly food is good, maybe gently warming the food, and adding various healthy flavour enhancers which are listed on my website. People should demonstrate by their behaviour that nothing odd is going on. They should try to mix up a little bit of the new food, maybe 10% with 90% of the old food, and the next day transition to maybe 20-80 and so on. Don't worry if you have a particularly clever cat or dog that carefully picks around the new food and refuses to eat it. Simply having it sitting there with the normal food will help to make the necessary association in its mind. Don't demonstrate by your behaviour that you think anything strange is going on. Eventually, if you are patient and persistent, your animal will start to eat the new food. But it can take 6 months or even longer to transition very, very stubborn animals onto the new diet. But patience and persistence virtually always succeeds in the end. Because people are increasingly concerned about climate change, environmental destruction caused by animal agriculture, and the health of their cats and dogs, people are increasingly exploring alternatives to meat-based diets. Those include plant-based diets. They include so-called clean meat or cellular agriculture, so growing meat literally in a petri dish or something similar. And it includes diets formulated from insects which are high in protein, which theoretically should be good for cats that need a fairly high protein content, and maybe dogs as well. There are questions about the degree to which insects are actually sentient and can experience suffering. Many people find the idea of insects very unpleasant, although they're not being asked to eat them themselves. The practicalities of providing cellular meat on a really large scale have not yet been overcome. Maybe at some future point it'll be available on a large scale and easy to access and affordable, but certainly not yet. The plant-based diets are certainly available today in many regions, and my website has a list of supplies of those in many regions of the world. On my website I do provide the opinions of some other veterinarians that know about plant-based diets for cats and dogs. People are increasingly exploring plant-based diets for themselves because they're becoming more and more aware of the extreme climate emergency that our planet is now going into, and that animal agriculture is a major cause of that because of the land clearing and because of the greenhouse gases that it produces. And they're increasingly concerned about their own health. These same concerns apply to meat-based diets for companion animals too. We know that if all the cats and dogs in America, just America, were their own country, they would be about the 5th largest worldwide in terms of meat consumption. So the proportion of meat that cats and dogs eat is substantial, and it does contribute to environmental destruction and to their own health problems. They're becoming increasingly overweight. The majority of cats and dogs in the United Kingdom are now overweight. So overnutrition is a problem for them, as with human beings, and too much consumption of poor quality diets is a problem. Plant-based diets, when formulated well, can supply all the nutrients they need with none of the hazards that are so common in commercial meat-based diets. So there are potential health benefits for these cats and dogs as well. A lot of the food in commercial diets for cats and dogs is byproducts of the meat industry for human beings. So this means that the products which are considered unfit for human consumption because they are poor quality, because the meat is diseased or cancerous, because the animals have arrived at the slaughterhouse dead, diseased, dying or disabled, the 4 Ds, or there is meat that is past the use-by date in supermarkets. A lot of this is also rendered into pet food to enable the meat industry to make a little bit more money from all of this meat that would otherwise be thrown away. So unfortunately, these poor quality ingredients often end up in pet food for cats and dogs. There are chemicals used to add fat to the diets and to increase the flavour, the palatability. And often, for example, restaurant grease, so oils which are used to deep fry foods in restaurants, particularly fast food restaurants, are used again and again throughout the evening, and building up carbonated waste products, free radicals, trans fatty acids, all of which can potentially cause tissue damage. and these will sometimes be scraped off the hot plate and collected up in great big tins, which are then sold on to pet food companies to be used as fat blenders and sprayed onto dry kibble to give it that distinctive smell that you smell when you cut open a packet of dry kibble. The smell wafts out, and it makes the food more fatty and tasty to cats and dogs. So that's hazardous for them to be eating. There are very powerful preservatives which are designed to try to prevent colonisation by microorganisms and to preserve the chemical makeup of the foods. Some of these have been banned in the European Union because they are also quite powerful carcinogens. They can cause cancer, they can cause liver disease, kidney disease and other problems in the body as well, neurological diseases. It's especially a feature of raw diets for cats and dogs. So we might be talking about bacteria such as E. coli, Listeria, Yersinia, many others. We might be talking about worm eggs, protozoa, prions. There are also fungi which tend to colonise food which is stored in warehouse for prolonged periods, and these can produce their own toxins. Aflatoxicosis, for example, is quite famous. It's killed tens of dogs in outbreaks of aflatoxicosis. So there are a whole host of potentially hazardous ingredients, unfortunately, that have actually killed significant numbers of cats and dogs that come from commercial meat-based diets. When I first became interested in this issue, I searched the scientific literature for studies demonstrating the supposed health problems that cats would experience on plant-based diets and also dogs. I could only find one where a diet that was already known to be deficient in potassium was fed to cats for a long period of time, who then developed potassium deficiency. But I couldn't find any others. I accidentally found 10 studies, and I've now found another one demonstrating that cats and dogs maintained on commercial meat-based diets for prolonged periods of time. On the various different diets, they developed diseases such as liver disease, kidney disease, neurologic disease, heart disease, immunocompromisation and various other problems. As veterinarians in practice, we have been increasingly seeing over the years our cats and dogs become more overweight, but also developing high proportions of tumours and also diseases like kidney disease. And to me, it's common sense that if we feed animals potentially hazardous ingredients which are causing tissue reactions, some of which are precursors to mutations or cancers, if we keep doing that 2 or 3 times a day for the lifetime of an animal, to me it's common sense that we may well see an increased level of problems such as cancers, problems of the liver and the kidneys. These are the main organs responsible for filtering toxins out of the bloodstream, and if there are low levels of toxins over a long period of time, these are the organs that will be most affected by those toxins. And we're also seeing animals become overweight as well. Premium brands for cats and dogs are less likely to have byproducts of the meat industry and more likely to have animals that have been killed just for pet food. However, this raises much more serious animal welfare and ethical problems for the farm animals. We know that almost all of the animals that are killed in the farming industry are intensively farmed, where they're raised in highly restrictive environments, where they experience many stresses such as overcrowding and the inability to exercise highly motivated natural behaviours. And they're also killed at a very premature stage of life. So there are major animal welfare and ethical concerns associated with the killing of animals directly for pet food. People often think it's unnatural to consider feeding cats or dogs on a plant-based diet, but we need to remember what the natural lifestyle of a cat would be. It would involve killing a large number of small mammals, birds, large insects. Whenever a kill was made, the cat would eat as much as possible to prevent consumption by competitors. This would be followed by uncertain periods of hunger or starvation. In contrast, we actually feed cats and dogs body parts from cows, sheep, chickens, fish, animals they would never naturally eat at predictable times daily, formulated as dry kibble or packaged up in tins with a whole host of unnatural and potentially hazardous contaminants. So the feeding regime of cats and dogs today is actually nothing like a natural feeding regime for cats and dogs. And it's probably a lot more unethical actually to inflict upon our cats and dogs diets which are full of contaminants and potentially hazardous ingredients than to feed them a plant-based diet that supplies all the nutrients that they need without any of these potentially hazardous contaminants. So what is the evidence that cats and dogs can be healthy on plant-based diets? There are many individual cases that you can find on the internet or in books describing cats and dogs which have been healthy long-term and potentially experiencing certain health benefits on plant-based diets. But the most reliable evidence comes from population studies, controlled studies looking at large groups of cats and dogs, and there are at least a couple of these looking at cats and dogs. With respect to dogs, looking at sprint racing Siberian Huskies, and it's hard to think of any dogs that have higher nutritional demands than sprint racing Siberian Huskies. Now, the other study looked at a population of cats that have been maintained on plant-based diets for at least 1 year and compared them with meat-eating cats. Jointly, these studies have shown that cats and dogs maintained on these diets long-term and undergoing the highest levels of exercise can be perfectly healthy and very often perform outstandingly in sprint racing sled races. There are many reports that you can easily find in books dealing with this issue or on the internet of cats and dogs being maintained on plant-based diets, and they often report clusters of health benefits, and they will typically be improvements in the skin and coat condition, decrease in skin allergies, intolerances, food reactions, decrease in external parasites. There will often be a slimming down of body weight, a reduction in arthritis, musculoskeletal disorders, diabetes can regress, cataracts, which are often associated with diabetes, which can be associated with being overweight. So often these diseases are linked together. You can also see many stories of increased overall health and vitality, animals appearing to feel better and to enjoy life more.